Robert, who is calling in from Texas. Robert from Texas, you're live on Truth Wanted. What's up?
Oh, hi, first call. Yeah.
Heck yeah, Robert. What's up?
Yeah, my question is mostly for Keith, but Dan, if you want to chime in as well. I've encountered both from people I know personally that study to be ministers, but also from people like William Lane Craig and the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy. It's this view that like the first 10 books or so of Genesis, like the creation story, Garden of Eden, Noah, the Tower of Babel, that is all obviously mythology or happened, but in some limited way. But then they will go on to say that everything after that, starting with Abraham and his descendants, that's all history. They'll go on to say that is history, that is historical fact, even down to Abraham having camels, which is something I think has been disproven or something. But I was wondering what you guys thought about that point of view, because to me, it's setting you up to be disappointed later. I don't know.
Yeah. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, great question, by the way. I just want to recommend an excellent resource to sort of, if anyone interested in that topic. There's a book by Richard Elliott Friedman. It's called Who Wrote the Bible? And it's not a dry, boring sort of theological book. It's actually written almost like a mystery novel, like a thriller. And it's a page turner. It's really very, very engaging and exciting. And he's essentially answering exactly that question about, who wrote the Bible? And like, for example, noticing the fact that all those early Old Testament passages, for example, there are two versions of the same story. If you ever tried to slog through and read the Old Testament, you've probably noticed like you'll read something in chapter 10, and you get to chapter 11, and they'll tell you the same thing basically again. Like, I just read this. Why are they telling me again?
Mm-hmm.
And that happens all through the Old Testament. And the reason why is that there was a time in Israel's history, there were two kingdoms. There was a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And so there were two separate Jewish communities. But yet they had sort of their own, still had their own sort of, their parables, their stories of Genesis or Abraham or Moses or these kind of things. But each community had slightly different versions of these stories. For example, the one in the south was where the temple was. And so they tended to emphasize the importance of the priesthood. There's only one, proper, correct way to offer sacrifices, and it must be in the temple, and it must be by a priest. And if you don't, you're in trouble. But of course, the ones in the northern kingdom, since they didn't have access to the temple, were sort of like, God doesn't care about that. It's not a big deal. And so you kind of get these two different flavors. And at some point that the kingdoms came together again, they think it was during the reign of King Josiah. And so to reconcile these two separate communities that for so long had been separate, someone literally edited these two separate Bibles into one Bible, which is the one we have now, the Old Testament we have now. It's a fascinating story. And what he actually does is try to figure out who was the person in history who actually did this. So number one is showing that it happened. And number two, demonstrating it happened. And two, then figuring out sort of CSI Jerusalem, who did this. It's a fascinating book. And he gets into all the facts that, things that you kind of alluded to. Like, we know there are multiple, stories of a flood, right? There are flood stories that predate Judaism. Yeah. There are different stories of creation. There are different stories of different cultures. We found them. We know that parallel pretty closely some of the stories that end up kind of retold with Jewish names in the Old Testament. And I think that's probably accurate. They were parables and stories. I really don't believe there was a talking snake. I don't really believe that there's a talking donkey. I mean, again, these are parables and stories. Most Jewish, rabbis and teachers are very, very comfortable with the fact that these are stories, that it's not a documentary. It's not some historical, factual thing. And again, we have no evidence that there was ever a kingdom like David ever reigned ever on a throne in Jerusalem ever. All these kinds of things. There's no evidence of an Exodus. There is no archaeological evidence for a lot of these things. It doesn't mean those stories, again, the Jewish people know that and they don't really care. They value there's wisdom in some of these texts that they take to heart. And I think a lot of Christians could benefit from backing off a little bit from this insistence that these are if I had a time machine and went back in time, I could shake Adam's hand, or I could meet, these people. Like I think we need to at least entertain the possibility that isn't the case.
Yeah, this was a part of my journey with figuring this stuff out, because like I've mentioned this on the show before, but I never struggled with like evolution as a concept. I was never like a young earth creationist, but I knew a lot of people that did. And so, obviously you at some point, if you're really considering this, you kind of have to reconcile that, because the Bible doesn't really support the idea of evolution any way whatsoever. It doesn't really work. So like, when you start to think about it and you look at these texts, and then again, like you're talking about, when you're looking at, well, who really wrote this stuff? Well, I don't think it was Moses.
No.
I don't think Moses one, it talks about him in third person. And while that doesn't necessarily, count as evidence against it, it also just doesn't make sense based on what we know about the language and the time periods of which these texts were written, as well as what Keith was talking about. There are multiple versions of the same stories put together in certain parts. There's 2 different creation stories.
Yes,
there's 2 different flood stories, really 3, kind of like 2.5. And it's you don't think about it, because when we learn about a lot of these texts, we go in Sunday school and we read like a paragraph, and then you're done for the day. You don't really sit down and read about it. And when you kind of do that exercise for yourself, and you're like, what the heck? This doesn't make any sense. These are 2 different things. Suddenly it makes more sense when you look at it from the perspective of, these were human beings collecting these stories and recording them as part of their own culture's beliefs and culture's writings, and had radically different interpretations of what modern Christians believe today. And you can look at old Jewish texts and see the rabbinic commentaries on this stuff, and they had way different thoughts. It was not completely accepted at any point in the history of these stories that these were always meant to be taken literally. I don't think that's the case. I think history demonstrates that otherwise. And so it's funny when Christians talk about oh, you have to take these literally, because the Jewish people today, a lot of them do not take those stories literally. So they were there first. So not the people today, but it's their beliefs come from a commentary and tradition that's older than Christianity. So it's something that we have to consider for sure.
Yes.
So there you go, Robert. What do you think?
I mean, from what I've studied, most of that, so I've encountered, that the hypothesis about the theories about the divided kingdom authorship, and some of it I was probably read even later than that. I would think probably too. I think I guess my only thing left would be, Keith, is do you take, as someone who's still a believer, do you take some personal meaning from maybe some of these early Genesis stories? I don't know.
No, honestly. I mean, I know there are some good things in these stories. I mean, there's some that I appreciate more than others. I really love, I've always really loved the Joseph story about how his brothers sell him into slavery, and that whole thing about how they think he's dead, but he's the Pharaoh, and he tests them to find out if they changed their heart. And he goes and cries behind the pillar, and I think it's a beautiful story. I mean, I would love to see a movie that would really do it justice. I think it's a wonderful story, but it's a story. I don't look at these things as historical. And now maybe some of them are. I mean, I'm okay if they are. I'm okay if they're not. In other words, I don't have such a faith in the Bible. This is the problem. This is why for a lot of Christians, this what we're talking about makes them really nervous, because they have kind of put all their eggs in this basket, that they kind of have more faith in the Bible than anything. And the minute you start pulling the thread on the fact that the Bible isn't what I thought it was, now suddenly I don't know what's true, right? So it makes them nervous. So that's kind of think that's why I try to encourage Christians, don't put too much stock in whether this is literal or this really happened or not.
But I think it's more beautiful to wrestle with that. Obviously I'm a skeptic now, but even when I was a Christian, I was more fond of the idea of having that be a lifelong relationship with the text. I think that's a kind of a Jewish thing too. You see that in some of the rabbinic commentaries also. Obviously, I don't have any specific religious meaning with any of this text at all. I try to view it from an academic perspective, and then sometimes from a comedy perspective on this show. But you know, when I was a Christian, like that made sense to me. You know, it's hard for me now to look back and view it the way that I did, but it's also because I didn't have a complete picture of this text. You know, I wasn't given all the pieces to start to work with. And I wonder what my religious identity would look like if I was given all that information from the start, or if even I would have a religious identity at all, if I would still come back to the place I'm at. But anyway, Robert, we got to get to some other callers. Thanks for calling in.
All right.
Great call. Great question. And looking forward to some more great conversations.